Doing time, punishment measured in months and years behind bars. It's a system so ingrained in our culture that it's hard to imagine the concept has only existed for scarcely more than 200 years. Sing Sing Prison was a pioneer in developing and testing this new method of punishment, and along the way, it became a model for penitentiaries throughout the world. But creating a prison system wasn't an easy task. The first years at Sing Sing were characterized by unimaginable brutality. The infamous bank robber Willie Sutton spent most of his adult life in and out of different penitentiaries. He called Sing Sing the most horrible prison he'd ever been in. Sing Sing earned its reputation by housing the toughest criminals from New York City. Its legend grew from the Hollywood movies filmed at the prison. Sing Sing gave birth to the terms Big House and Up the River. It was also where the phrase last mile was originated, as more than 600 inmates were marched to Sing Sing's electric chair. Among them, crime czar Louis Lepke Buchalter and A-bomb spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Today, more than 170 years after it opened, Sing Sing remains one of the most notorious penitentiaries in the world. Jails have existed for centuries, but in the beginning, they were merely holding pens for criminals waiting to be tried or to receive their punishment. Living conditions in these dungeons were grim. Often there were no beds or bedding, no bathing facilities, and open sewers were commonplace. When it came time for punishment, the options were public humiliation, banishment, torture, or the gallows.
For minor offenses, things like women for gossiping would have a bit like a horse in their mouth, and then they'd be strapped to a long pole with a fulcrum, and they'd be dunked in the river or a pond. Or if it was a little more serious, they'd have their ear nailed to a cart and be on exhibit for a day.
Felons, when they were convicted, were sentenced not to serve in a prison, not to give up their liberty for a set period of time, but were rather sentenced to suffer either capital punishment or corporal punishment, everything from putting a person on the rack, to whipping them, to severing fingers, mutilating them in other ways, cutting off ears, and so forth.
This arbitrary system offered little leniency. Even for minor crimes, repeat offenders were simply hung.
The system before the penitentiary is highly uneven. It goes mild, 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 severe. If you will, it's a system that doesn't have any middle range of punishment. You let them off with more or less a slap, or you execute them. There's nothing in between.
After the American Revolution, the United States took the lead in penal reform.
The revolution is the key moment here, in which Americans begin to identify the old corporal punishments with monarchy and England, and so they are about the business of inventing a new form of punishment that they think is appropriate to living in a republic. And slowly, the penitentiary comes into place with its commitment to reformation.
The Pennsylvania Quakers were the first to implement prison sentences as punishment. In Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail, they built a cell block with 16 individual cells. Here, inmates would serve their entire sentences locked in their cells, maintaining absolute silence. The reformers believed this extreme isolation, combined with labor and religious study, would return the sinners to their innate goodness. In 1797, New York State opened Newgate Prison in New York City, and later in 1815, Auburn Prison in the western part of the state. New York would try a different method of incarceration called the congregate or Auburn system. In their prisons, inmates would also be required to maintain silence. But during the day, they would be let out to work in factories with other inmates. Officials believed this method was more humane and hoped the workshops would be lucrative enough to make the prison self-supporting. By the 1820s, it was clear that Newgate would not be large enough to serve New York City's exploding population and crime rate. Construction of a large new prison was approved. A site was chosen near Ossining, New York, about 30 miles up the Hudson River from New York City, hence the term up the river. The town and the prison both derived their names from the area's early inhabitants, the Sint Sink Indians, whose name means stone on stone. The location chosen for the new prison was a rich marble quarry that would provide raw materials for construction as well as a profitable labor source for the future inmates. Captain Elam Linds was appointed to lead the project.
In 1825, Captain Linds came down from Auburn. He was the warden at Auburn Prison, and he came down with 100 inmates down the Erie Canal and down the Hudson River, and they came in here, set up temporary quarters, and then built this cell block. They quarried the stone from up on the hill, came down, and they built the cell block. It took them 3 years to complete 4 tiers of this cell block. So in 1828, they were finally finished.
Today, only the shell remains of this mammoth cell block, 476 feet long, 4 tiers high, with over 800 cells. The design was similar to Auburn, with a freestanding cell block built within the walls of a secure building. It was believed that this structure would eliminate the need for a prison wall. Because men were only to be confined at night, each cell measured only 7 feet deep by less than 3.5 feet wide. There was no running water and only a bucket for a toilet. This same structure would serve as Sing Sing's primary cell block for more than 100 years. Willie Sutton served time in these grim quarters in 1926. He wrote, "Very little sunlight penetrated the block, and the only ventilation was through the pattern of 1-inch square holes in the doors. The cell was so narrow you had to walk in sideways, and the walls were made up of jagged rocks, which were pointed like daggers." The block also included a new technical innovation, a locking system that allowed keepers to secure 50 cells at once. The facade of the building was also designed to play a role in the prison's philosophy. Sing Sing has a totally austere and blank facade, indicating that life inside is harsh and cold with no luxuries. There are also no obvious doors, reinforcing the notion that there is no exit from this prison. A penitentiary that would soon earn the name, the House of Fear. By the 1830s, Sing Sing's cell block was surrounded by workshops, factories, a chapel, a kitchen, and a hospital, and over 500 inmates were confined at the prison. Elam Linds became the first warden, and his administration set the tone for the prison's fearsome reputation. Linds had little faith in the ability of inmates to be reformed. He was a former Army captain and felt that the only way to control the inmates in this congregate setting was through strict discipline. Linds encouraged his guards to inflict punishment and treat prisoners with contempt. He once said that he felt it was impossible to govern a large prison without a whip.
Sing Sing has the distinction of inventing the lockstep. The lockstep is a mix of march and shuffle. Their arms are extended, each one on the shoulder of the man in front of them, moving them in unison, and they are easily watched and guarded, and it's also supposed to be a kind of humbling sort of experience. They are, of course, wearing, and this is the first time it happens, they are wearing striped uniforms.
Striped uniforms would quickly identify convicts if they escaped and were considered an additional way to humiliate prisoners.
From the moment you entered Sing Sing, there was a notion and an effort to reshape your identity. You were given instructions about the governing principles of the institution, about behavior, and then your hair would be shaved. Some of the inmates' accounts talk about haircuts that seem to be deliberately disfiguring. You then are issued a set of stripes. They rarely fit you, and most egregiously, you're given a pair of shoes which do not fit you. This becomes a very difficult moment because in the next 3 days, you're going to learn how to do the lockstep. Now imagine doing that with a pair of ill-fitting shoes. The pain of this got so grievous that we know men attempted suicide within the first week of Sing Sing.
Like the rival system in Pennsylvania, the congregate system demanded absolute silence. The Quakers felt it would lead to reformation, but at Sing Sing, it was used for control.
Silence is the advantage of the keeper versus the inmate. Communication allows the inmate to conspire. In conspiring, he creates the connections that make up the prison subculture. If I can prevent him from communicating, I could break the back of that subculture, and then I have the upper hand.
Punishment for violating the rules was swift and severe. The most common infraction was breaking the rule of silence. The whip, or cat-o'-nine-tails, was the favorite method of punishment. Linns preferred a cat with 6 wire-tipped leather strips. Levi Burr was an inmate at the prison in the 1830s and wrote an account of his brutal experience. Burr described the harsh government of Sing Sing as a catocracy and wrote about a lashing a fellow inmate received. 2 cats were flailing the skin off the body, and the affected subject was begging upon his knees and crying and twisting under the lacerating that tore his skin from his back.
The punishments are inflicted in a central hall. The sound of the inmate screaming can be heard by other inmates. That's done intentionally. The blood that is spilled from these punishments is left in place on the floor as a warning to other inmates.
In 1848, flogging was outlawed, so keepers invented creative new ways to discipline inmates. The iron cage was often administered, where the rule breaker was forced to keep the painful cage on his head 24 hours a day. The most frequent punishment was the shower bath. This torture was administered in 2 ways. One was to place a collar around the inmate's neck and then slowly fill it with water. Eventually, the water covers the mouth and nose, creating the sensation of drowning. The other version was simply to dump a tremendous quantity of cold water on the convict's head. The nature of the infraction determined the volume of water. The shower bath was a highly desirable punishment because it left no disfiguring marks. By the 1880s, the principal form of punishment became the darkened cell, a cramped dungeon with no light, no food, and no water. Time in the cell would be determined by the severity of the infraction. In 1839, Sing Sing built a women's prison on the hill above the main cell block. Conditions were just as bad for female inmates. However, in 1845, Eliza Farnham took over as matron and tried to reform both the women's and the men's prison. She was an advocate of phrenology, a pseudoscience of the day that theorized criminal behavior was caused by underdeveloped areas of the brain. Phrenologists believed that by studying the bumps on the head, they could identify criminals. Farnham felt that physical punishment only stimulated these negative areas of the brain, and rehabilitation was the most effective approach.
She brings a piano, and all of a sudden there's music inside the women's penitentiary. On July 4th, she insists that the principal inspector send every woman in the women's prison a rose. All of those rigid disciplines are relaxed under her governance. And the outsiders really thought of this as the work of a woman who had really gone over the edge.
Farnham lobbied for this same humane treatment for the men, but by 1848, outrage over her liberal policies forced her resignation. Sing Sing's women's prison was closed altogether in 1877. Also, in 1877, a prison wall was finally built. It was designed to prevent escapes, but it was also added in the hope of reducing the level of control needed by the jailers. The American penitentiary system and Sing Sing became a fascination. Curiosity seekers made the prison a popular tourist attraction, with some 1,500 people a year making the trek from New York City. For 25 cents, visitors could watch the inmates through specially constructed peepholes, an activity referred to as the pornography of the 19th century. But the American prisons were also studied by serious scholars from around the world, many of whom were considering instituting a penitentiary system in their own countries.
This was not an embarrassment. We were proud of these prisons. We thought that we were doing something that everybody should emulate. And in fact, we set off a spark of change. We become known as the center of the innovation that is the prison.
Pennsylvania and New York became fierce rivals, each vying to have their system adopted. Sing Sing's inmate labor was attractive because of the income it generated. But Pennsylvania claimed New York's brutal system eliminated all hope of rehabilitation. Ultimately, economics won out, and Sing Sing's congregate system became the worldwide standard for 19th century penitentiaries. Gradually, reform began to take effect at Sing Sing. Originally, there were no visits or letters permitted. By the 1880s, inmates were allowed one visit every 2 months and one letter a month. For the first time, inmates were issued a camphine lamp for reading in their cells at night. The 20th century brought an entirely new approach to the treatment of prisoners. Brutality was curbed, and striped uniforms were a thing of the past. The idea now was that the granting of privileges was more conducive to discipline than brutality. On December 6, 1914, Thomas Mott Osborne became Sing Sing's warden, ushering in a new enlightened era to the institution. Osborne had earned his reputation as a reformer at Auburn Prison. He had disguised himself as an inmate and lived inside the walls for a week. This experience inspired Osborne to conclude, every inmate must have the most practical amount of individual freedom, because it is liberty alone that fits a man for liberty.
One of his philosophies was that for inmates to stop coming to jail and to prisons, they had to take responsibilities for themselves. And he looked for ways in the prison system to help inmates take on this responsibility. One of the things he developed was something called a mutual welfare league, an inmate-governed body, which was totally unheard of at the time, and is actually unheard of even today, where the inmates would form a court of such. They would even met out discipline to other inmates. They got other inmates involved in sporting activities. They had a commissary way back then. They even had a token economy. Their motto was do good, make good.
By 1916, Osborne was forced out by more conservative elements, but the Mutual Welfare League and many of his forward-thinking policies lived on. 1921 began the term of Warden Lewis Laws. He almost single-handedly engraved the name Sing Sing in America's culture. He too was a great prison reformer, but he was also a tireless promoter who wrote books, performed on radio shows, and appeared in newsreels.
Sing Sing Prison. From within its walls, Metrotone brings a message of profound import to every father and mother in America. Listen to Warden Laws lay bare one of the nation's most appalling problems.
From my desk within the walls of Sing Sing, I see daily the constantly increasing numbers of boys and young men who are committed to prison. A very great proportion of these boys could have been made into law-abiding, resourceful citizens. Here is a group I would like you to scrutinize.
He hoped his media efforts would deter youth from a life of crime.
You may be shocked by their youth, yet they are typical of the small army of young men that make up a major portion of the population of our prisons. We have come to the aid of our failing banks. We have a corps organized to save our forests. Why haven't we some plan for youth that will take our young people off the road? That road that leads them year after year in a constant procession to the gates of our penitentiary.
Laws also allowed many Hollywood movies to film in the prison, further enhancing the legend of Sing Sing.
I'm doing life, 199 years, so no pardon, no parole. And you can't crash over those walls in a million years. The only chance is to get to the courthouse and try it from there. Where do I come in?
Such classic dramas as Each Dawn I Die, Angels with Dirty Faces, and Law's own book, 20,000 Years in Sing Sing. Laws often invited Major League Baseball teams to play against the Mutual Welfare League team known as the Black Sheep.
You think he'll sail home? He oughta. He's had enough practice sailing.
The story goes that Babe Ruth's longest home run, a 620-foot blast, was hit over the wall at Sing Sing. It was during Law's tenure that Sing Sing Prison was entirely rebuilt. The old cell block was overcrowded and outdated. There was talk of closing Sing Sing altogether. However, in 1926, it was decided to build two massive new blocks up the hill from the original prison. A and B blocks became two of the largest cell houses in the world and are still in use today. Laws also witnessed hundreds of electrocutions during his time, but he was always an outspoken critic of the electric chair. He once said, "I realized that the most horrible crime that can be committed is the killing of a human being. And likewise, the most horrible punishment that can be imposed is the killing of a human being." Laws was respected by both staff and inmates, a sentiment that was evident when his wife died in 1937.
The warden's house was on the edge of the prison at the time, and part of her funeral was that every single inmate filed single file out through the gates and past her casket and back in.
Lewis Laws retired in 1941 after 19 years, the longest tenure of any warden in Sing Sing history. True to form, he played to the media until the very end.
So it's farewell to the big house by one who's seen thousands of prisoners come and go.
Today, this unassuming building near the old cell block is the Sing Sing Vocational Shop, but the origins of this structure will forever be intertwined with perhaps the most controversial means of punishment ever devised by man. This was once the Sing Sing Death House. the home of the electric chair. During the 19th century, the most common method of capital punishment was the gallows. But hanging had always been a gruesome and haphazard affair. New York's legislature looked to electrocution as a more humane method. However, the motives behind the creation of the electric chair are far more insidious. During the 1880s, a fierce competition had developed between Thomas Edison and rival George Westinghouse. Each wanted their electrical systems to become the method of choice for supplying power to America's cities. But Edison's DC current was in fact more expensive and less efficient than the Westinghouse AC current. So Edison embarked on a smear campaign against his competitor.
The Edison company was determined to show that Westinghouse AC current was very dangerous to life and that there were more fatal accidents as a result of this. So they dispatched a team of engineers throughout the Northeast to demonstrate the dangers of this, and they usually did it by killing a few animals using Westinghouse current.
Prison officials took note of these demonstrations and developed an electric chair for the painless and instantaneous execution of human beings. On August 6, 1890, at Auburn Prison, William Kemmler, who had murdered his lover with an axe, became the first victim of the electric chair. Prison officials hailed the event as marking a new era in humane punishment, but actually the execution did not go well. It was gruesome and far from instantaneous. Kemmler's death began a grisly period of trial and error where executioners worked to perfect the use of the chair. But most executions were accompanied by revolting accounts of burning flesh, foaming mouths, and exploding eyeballs. Edison was quick to capitalize on negative publicity, and he chose electrocution as the topic of one of the first motion pictures ever produced. This 1901 dramatization shows the chair being tested with light bulbs before the victim is let in for the electrocution sequence.
The usual pattern was an electric shock was administered of about 2,000 volts for about 3 or 4 seconds. That was then reduced down to about 500 volts, and it went back up then to 2,000 volts. And there was this up and down process that lasted about 2 minutes. The expectation, and at least the doctors who testified to this, is that in the first 3 seconds the inmate died instantly because of the size of the voltage. Usually he reached about 140 degrees body temperature, which was sufficient to boil the brain.
Sing Sing's first electrocution was performed in 1891 in a chair nicknamed Old Sparky. At this time, 3 New York prisons had electric chairs, but in 1914 it was decided to build the state's only death house at Sing Sing.
There's a growing recognition that it ought to be done in one site where a kind of specialty develops in taking care of this. The prison officials, for example, took great pains to prevent inmates from committing suicide. There are examples of heroic surgery to save inmates who ingested various things they found in an effort to kill themselves to cheat the chair. No one should be allowed to cheat the chair.
614 electrocutions were performed at Sing Sing, the last in 1963. It seems the deaths were almost always at the center of an emotional and contentious debate. In 1920, the flamboyant investigative journalist Nellie Bly became the first woman to witness an electrocution. The subject was one Gordon Hamby. Hamby tried to be blasé about the electric chair. As he was strapped in, he told the witnesses he'd gladly try anything once. But Nellie Bly was horrified by the proceedings, calling for an end to this punishment. She wrote, "Thou shalt not kill." Was that commandment meant alone for Hamby, or did it mean all of us? 1928 brought new controversy when Ruth Snyder and her lover, Judd Gray, were executed for the brutal murder of Snyder's husband. One of the witnesses to Snyder's electrocution was a New York Daily News photographer who had secretly strapped a camera to his leg. The next morning, Snyder's final moment was on the front page of papers across the country, causing a national outcry against the electric chair. In 1944, Louis Lepke Buckhalter was executed. He was the head of the U.S. crime syndicate and its enforcement arm, Murder Incorporated. Two of Buckhalter's flunkies, Louis Capone and Emanuel Mendy Weiss, also died in the chair that night. Loyal to the end, Capone and Weiss ordered the same dinner as their boss. Lepke assured them the fix was in and they wouldn't die. Lepke was wrong. But perhaps the most controversial of all was the 1953 electrocution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the young couple who were convicted of selling atomic bomb secrets to the Russians. Their sentence triggered violent protest, and the execution became one of the most celebrated media events of the era. Crowds gathered outside the prison waiting for a reprieve from the Supreme Court or President Eisenhower. But the order never came, and the Rosenbergs became the first civilians executed for treason in the United States. Rabbi Irving Kozlow was the prison chaplain at the Rosenbergs' execution and has been present at 17 electrocutions. Kozlow would counsel the condemned man for years before his execution. From this experience, he has a rare insight into the psychology of the condemned inmate and death by the electric chair.
The major difference between dying in a hospital and dying at the chair is a major difference. Was that in a hospital, a patient never knew the exact moment they might leave this world. Whereas when you put an electric chair, you knew in advance that, at least the Sing Sing, at Thursday night, 11 o'clock, you would be in that chair, and a minute or so later, you would be dead.
Executions all followed a similar sequence. The day before, the condemned man is moved from the death row cell block to a group of cells near the electric chair, an area known as the dance hall. Here, final preparations are made, including shaving the convict's head. Kozlow would comfort the inmate through these final preparations. On Thursday, Kozlow would spend the entire day with the inmate and accompany him until the end.
I would spend time in that cell with him. And all day long, we'd prayer, a conversation, what exactly was going to happen in that execution room, life after death, a variety of topics were covered. Comfort. Was it painful? To me, death was moving along slowly but surely.
At about 6 p.m., he is offered his last meal.
For Last Supper, they're given anything they want at 6 o'clock. Not one inmate or one person that was ever touched any of that food. They could order steaks and ice cream, and they sent it all to the back to the wings they came from, back to the death house, inmates.
Finally, the excruciating wait draws to a close, and the guards come for the condemned man.
By the time a knock on the door came, which was about 1 or 2 minutes to 11, as far as I was concerned, that man or woman was half dead. Really, it was no longer as articulate or as responsive as he had been Wednesday and Thursday, you see, all day. And I'd tell him, look, follow me. There'll be 2 correctional on either side of you walking down this corridor, which is maybe 20 feet, no last mile, 20 feet of corridor. And as we got close to the door, it would swing open. I told the man, it's going to swing open. You'll be taken by the 2 correctional officers. Don't make any comments, because any statement you make to either the officers or to the witnesses or reporters who may be there will be misinterpreted and won't be accurate. I know that. There'll be 2 2 men inside beside a wooden chair. They'll seat you down quickly. They're going to put something over your eyes. Electrodes will be tied to your head and to your leg. It'll be very quick. I'll be as close to you as I am to you now. I'll stand right in front of you. I'll be on a rubber mat, but I'll be there and I'll offer some prayer. An appropriate prayer that we offer for a person who's going to leave this world. And that's all I can do. As soon as they're strapped in, there's a motion to the electrocutioner, and he would lower the electrode. And that was the first shot. Then another shot. The doctor would run over and open the shirt and test him. He said, "This man is dead." I'd seen death many times before, both as a rabbi in the army and so forth. So I wasn't shaken by death. But it is a different experience because I knew at that moment that man was going to die. And it's something you never forget.
In 1965, the death penalty was abolished in New York State. 30 years later, it was reinstated. But future executions will be performed by lethal injection. Sing Sing holds the unusual distinction of being the only prison with a railroad running through it. Undoubtedly, more than one escape attempt has been inspired by the hope of hopping on board. The most notorious and bloody breakout came in April of 1941. Charles McGale, John Waters, and Joseph Reardon escaped through the prison hospital, killing a guard and later a local policeman. The daring attempt had been planned for more than 10 months with the help of several accomplices on the outside. The plan was set in motion on March 22nd when 3 guns were smuggled into the prison, strapped underneath a milk delivery truck. Waters hid the weapons in the hospital, where he worked as an orderly. McGale was a prison trustee who had access to tools and rope. He was also an expert locksmith. He made keys to a steam tunnel that ran from the hospital basement outside the prison. On the night of April 13th, Reardon and McGale faked illnesses and checked into the hospital. Waters slipped them the guns. At 2 a.m., the men made their move. They shot and killed Officer John Harty and scrambled through the 600-foot tunnel. Outside, they used McGale's rope to lower themselves down to the railroad tracks. Meanwhile, their accomplices waited at the nearby train station with a car and a machine gun. It was here that the foolproof plan began to unravel. The break was ahead of schedule, and when the fugitives arrived, their 2 friends were having a drink in a local tavern. Then, by pure chance, 2 Ossining policemen happened upon the escapees. The ensuing gun battle left Waters and Officer James Fagan dead. Reardon and McGale made their way to the Hudson River, where they ordered a fisherman, Charles Rohr, to row them across. A giant manhunt was launched with over 1,000 policemen searching for the killers. Finally, 7 hours later, the fugitives were apprehended. After a quick trial, the 2 accomplices were sentenced to life in prison, and Reardon and McGale died in the electric chair. Sing Sing's last major escape was in 1986 when 3 men broke out of the school building.
3 inmates tied together sneaker shoelaces. They made a rope, and they used that to shimmy down the wall and then shimmy down to the train tracks and went south towards the city. They didn't get too far.
The escapees were quickly recaptured, Since then, prisoners have been prohibited from having extra shoelaces in their cells. In 1994, the original wall was torn down and replaced by a state-of-the-art cement and security fence perimeter. But escapes continue to be a concern. Today, the prison holds over 2,200 inmates. More than 1,700 are in for violent crimes. Officers carry no guns. The only weapon they are allowed is a baton.
The reason why you don't carry a gun is they'll take it from you.
We're faced with inmates making all kinds of homemade weapons. They make it out of anything. A piece of bed, a piece of chair, they sharpen them. They have 24 hours to do this. And we set up metal detectors, we do pat frisking and stuff like that. But now plexiglass entered the scene. Now they make weapons out of plexiglass. Metal detectors are useless against that.
It's a very dangerous place. Wrong word, wrong move, anything could happen at any time. The trick and the secret is being firm, fair, and consistent. You have to be the same way every day. You can't be a nice guy today, a bad guy tomorrow.
The reformers that originally created the concept of the prison hoped this new approach to punishment would rehabilitate criminals. 200 years later, prison officials are still wondering if rehabilitation is possible.
Today, any inmate comes into the system in New York State has an opportunity to change and to be able to get out of prison and have options to not come back. And that starts by us in here addressing the reasons he came to prison in the first place. A number of years ago, an inmate could come into a system like this and go to the yard and lift weights all day. Well, that's not possible today. Basically, it is up to him still whether he changes or not, but we're going to be making it a little more difficult for him to not address those issues.
Now, as one looks at prisons, they seem so much a part and so traditional a part of the criminal justice system that we lose the ability to remember that they were the inventions of one generation. They were not here when Columbus arrived on these shores, and that there is something ultimately odd and strange about them. Where did we ever get the idea that if we put people behind walls in boxes in these artificial odd settings, we would release them better, more likely to be law-abiding? It's very, very strange. There is this tale of one inmate in the 1970s being asked, how is it? How are you finding prison life? And the inmate responded, look, in some ways, it's better than I thought it would be. In other ways, it's worse than I thought it would be. And then he paused and went on to say, but you know, I would love to meet the dude who dreamed up shit like this. He must have been made on Mars.